All right, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're here to talk about innovation and share our experiences of doing it over the years. Of course, we should talk about this title. What do we mean by realistic? Isn't innovation more science fiction than anything? Well, we're here to help you make a positive change, and that only occurs when something is delivered that shows tangible gain. Ideas are great, but they don't do much without execution. Before we get too far in here, just some quick introductions. Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm an Edmonton-based designer. I've been working as a designer in the software space at DevFacto for the better part of the last decade. And innovation for me, it goes back to my childhood, building things with my father, who was a carpenter. It was that act of creation and the ability to build the world you want to live in and to leave the world a better place. So for me, that's a lot of why I come at innovation, and it's been a lifelong thing for me. I'll hand it over to David to introduce himself as well.
Hi there, I'm David Cronin, one of the founders of DevFacto, and I've been a technologist my entire life. It started as a coder in the 80s and grew into a number of different career pursuits, working at startups, consulting firms, and finally landing here at DevFacto. And now I spend time working with clients on some of their tough problems, ensuring that the DevFacto team is always bringing value, that we're focused on outcomes, and mixing innovation in throughout the way. I'll turn it back to you, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, David. Great. So we'll be moving fast to cover all of this in about 30 minutes today. Please put your questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up in a few minutes of Q&A time at the end. So just quickly, we're going to talk first about what is innovation. Secondly, why you need to be innovating. We'll look at some of the common roadblocks third. And last, we'll go through how we approach innovation day in and day out, and how we got to where we are today. So we'll spend a couple minutes just framing innovation so that you know where we're coming from. Many people have a view of what innovation is, and we found that rarely do two people agree on the exact definition. Rather than debating the verbiage for next year's Merriam-Webster edition, we want to talk about a few critical things that we know to be true. First, the definition of innovation largely deals with new. We should all be able to agree on that. Second, innovation describes both the process and the outcome. While most people just think about the latter, you'll hear from us today that we think the true magic is in the process. That said, it's important to focus on both. If you never deliver an outcome, then you haven't really done anything. And if you only deliver once, no process to back it up, you'll quickly disappear. Next, innovation comes in three ways. And again, people mostly think of the tangible things you can hold in your hand, and often technology like VR headsets, for example. We can talk about innovative things that have landed in each of these areas, though. Often the best is a balance of all three. Some of my favorites from history, being a little bit of a process nerd, like how exactly were the pyramids built? How have we not figured this out? I don't know. There's new and there's old here. You can look back at the history. There's value there too. People, process, and technology, you can think of these as sparks or opportunity spaces as well. Of course, with my background in design thinking, I gravitate towards the people side and typically unearth my revolutionary ideas there. I've found that if you're solving a real human problem, the work you're doing will have good value. Of course, once you've used one or more of those sparks, you need to consistently assess if the idea is worth delivering on as you go, as you grow. Because the nature of innovation is new, we sometimes fall in love with the idea more than the problem we've set out to solve, and that's often when the biggest calamity occurs. I often refer to these three things as the should we, could we, would we, and over the years, we've actually found that they should be probably considered in that order. But simply put, you're trying to figure out, does it have legs? And if it has legs, how big of a beast is your idea? Some people will tell you that innovation has to be big, just change the fabric of the universe big. But we find that that view can keep you from making positive change as you go. What we know to be true is that innovation has to make an impact. It has to move the needle. It doesn't really matter if it was done in a big bang or many small ones. Were you able to get an old task done faster, better, safer? Did you do a brand new thing? It's really the question you're asking. And the sooner you know how big of a change you can expect, whether it's incremental, evolutionary, or revolutionary, the sooner you can begin preparing for the changes you're planning to bring. Change is hard. And we'll talk about some of the hard pieces of innovation as we go here. I'll pass it over to David to talk about why you need to be innovating.
So we've covered what innovation is, and but really, why is this important? We believe everyone needs to be working towards becoming more innovative. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about the why. And you're always faced with that question, do you really need innovation? And you might ask yourself this question from a few different perspectives, knowing that innovation involves change, and change is hard, and it can make us uncomfortable, it causes resistance from others. If we look back over the history of business, at least what we have in recent business texts over the last 50, 60, 70 years, you'll see that early on, innovation was seen as a nice to have, as an optional business strategy. And there were questions back then, and even to this day, really, that you might wonder, is there a risk of being too cutting edge or too far ahead of your competitors and customers? Or perhaps you already have enough change and you just feel there isn't room for innovation. But whatever your personal belief is or your experience is, it's clear that innovation is no longer an optional strategy. Now the focus is on finding ways to ensure innovation initiatives move forward. It's not whether we should innovate, it's how fast and how can we be intentional about moving these forward. It's focused on speed. And it should come as no surprise that this culture of innovation is what is driving some of the most successful and innovative companies out there. Now, certainly tech and technology in general is a driver for this change. Technology used to sit in its own silo in organizations, but now it's spread across every part of an organization, every business unit, every working group, and it's key to profitability, efficiency, and often survival. And there's really no organization that is immune to this need to innovate. So that, really, when it comes to the need to innovate, it can be really broken down to a few core drivers. You need to grow, you need to improve, you need to respond to change, you need to avoid disruption. Whatever the reason is, one thing I'll say from my personal experience is that innovation does usually take purposeful, focused change. It does not come in this flash of genius. There aren't just organizations that just become innovative by chance. It requires this rigorous discipline to move ideas into practice. Now, when we come to thinking about, why isn't every organization innovative? Why isn't there an innovation culture everywhere you go? Now, in our work, we've seen a lot of organizations, and it's fair to say that you all have barriers. We all have barriers. We see those barriers everywhere. They're quite well understood. It's not like there's this unknown reason why something isn't moving forward or why there's a roadblock. But the good news is there are tools to break these barriers down. When it comes to looking at those barriers, like the most common ones, and if we just really simplify it down to what we hear all the time from our perspective, is there's no time, there's no money, there's no goal, or perhaps there are no good ideas in our organization, or there's too many ideas in our organization. And as a consulting organization that works on hundreds of client engagements every year across North America, we see the same patterns. These are really common. There are an endless number of barriers that are there, and from groupthink to burnout to lack of support. Some of these are created because of fear of change or past negative experiences, but often these roadblocks exist because there isn't a clear way to bring new ideas forward to even build the case for an innovative way to solve the problem. Now, on the topic of ideas, it's important to understand the working relationship that exists in your organization. Now, early consensus on ideas can be an advantage, but not in the domain of innovation and creativity. You don't want to get to consensus right away. It's natural to look for consensus, and actually, often as organizations are looking to become more integrated and friendly. But actually, if you're looking for innovation, if you have a culture that's too nice, that doesn't challenge ideas, and that quickly moves to consensus, that's actually a barrier to innovation. Now, on the other extreme, some organizations, there's too much contention and there's no rules for how people operate, and people just don't feel safe sharing their best ideas, and they can't work collaboratively. And that also produces this void of innovation. And so it's really important to have some clear rules. This is one we use. There's more, there's variations of this, but the idea that people are always safe if their ideas are not, that's key to building this culture of innovation, and it's one of those roadblocks. Now, this foundational requirement on how to build a culture of innovation is really about understanding how to work collaboratively, not just within a team, but across the entire organization. And this should come as no surprise. This is a pretty common understanding. Now, aligning on the intent and the desired outcome is a really good way to move forward. But getting there doesn't happen all at once. A real practical way to get there is to iterate over a number of collaborative activities, to really get into this mode of moving through a cycle of looking at an idea, evaluating it, testing it, prototyping it, and so on. Which brings us to probably the most critical roadblock of all, and it's the most unexpected one, where you get into this productive routine that does not include the time and space for continual innovation. This is a pretty common thing we see where, across all methodologies, it doesn't matter if it's a traditional waterfall project approach or an agile engagement, and really everything in between, you can get into this feeling good about this build test cycle, for example, where you're producing new features in an incremental fashion, and it feels like you're being really effective, but you're not getting the full value from this iterative cycle if it doesn't include activities to review, adapt, refine, and re-envision what you're doing. It simply isn't good enough if you want to adapt to change and bring real positive outcomes. So using a well-defined framework is essential to build this culture of innovation, to ensure that implementation activities don't completely replace innovation activities. You can think about it like this, where the innovation of things needs to be blended into the building of things, whatever it is, whether it's building software or it could be data environments, useful business solutions, whatever the solution you're driving for. It's essential to have a framework that keeps you on track and brings that discipline. And bringing this into practice is how we have helped drive positive outcomes and real meaningful impact with our clients over the last 15 years.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. So I'll take it back here and we'll start to walk through a little bit of how we got here, actually. Just about a decade ago in 2013, we started exploring innovation as a company at DevFacto. And I'm going to share a bit about our journey, as it will show you how we've built up these ideas over time, which I hope can inform your growth towards being a more innovative organization. Now, if you've worked with us over the past 9 years, you've likely been a part of an ideation session, and we've gotten really good at that method and others like it. But we've also seen the magic can fade a bit as projects built around a good ideation might lose their luster somewhere in delivery. Teams get more concrete as they get near the finish line, which is natural. That's also when teams tend to miss great ideas. Our initial ideation activities were focused on fostering good idea collection and generation practices. And like David talked about earlier in the barriers, we quickly found ourselves surrounded by lists and lists of great ideas. Now, we've worked hard over the years on a few of what we call single output ideas that we generated ourselves in those days, things that might lead to a big bang type of innovation. And a few years ago, we had 2 innovative ideas incubating, and either of them could have taken off. But there is risk in putting all of your eggs in one basket. It's a startup, essentially, going all in on a single idea. But we believe that a broader view where you can repeat the process and build this culture of innovation is actually much more important. So we found ourselves with solid processes for a variety of work. We had people that could run them really well. But as we talked about, there's always barriers. It always seemed like, maybe the rigidity of process and the flexibility of innovation that innovation requires, maybe they just don't mix. So during this evolution, we saw firsthand how different ideas or teams needed to be supported in different ways to succeed. We also learned that while specific moments are similar, the overall innovation narrative is often unique, which means that there isn't really one end-to-end process that will always yield success. And trying to refine one long process to manage a wide variety of problems is rarely successful anyways. Now, if you know much about Agile, you can see a strong parallel here. Rather than try and define the whole thing up front, it makes far more sense to break these methods or activities down and respond to new information as you get it. So we got down to brass tacks and looked at our process and activities or methods. And we learned a lot doing this, but a key insight was understanding where we had made space for innovation and where we hadn't. What types of work naturally played to the strengths that we had already developed and where we still needed to grow. And we started to think about these activities as micro-innovation. And through that lens, we're continuing to experiment and improve in our journey. Now, this is a really practical way of getting more and more of our people on a footing for innovation. And as it becomes part of our normal work, we get better and better at making the most of these opportunities. But this approach of baking micro-innovation into each effort and iteration or sprint, it takes intent and focus, like David said earlier. If you think about your typical work cycle, do you have a healthy mix of activities? Depending on the nature of your work and the skill sets on your team, those will look different, but this is a low risk way to get started. And that question is still driving us, and I expect it will for quite a while. It seems obvious, but it's so easily overlooked in software development. Teams often feel good when they select items from a prioritized backlog and develop new features and do a little bit of testing and deploy and then repeat. And that sounds great on paper. But are you surfacing and gathering ideas regularly? Do you ever act on them? In your organization, are there negative repercussions for someone who wants to chase a hunch? When you learn something about what you just built, how does it shape your next steps? Do you have the activities or methods in place to dig into those hunches? These little things are what could culminate into a big thing. You know, for example, think of the telescope. We needed convex and concave lenses to build one. All right, these things build on each other over time. Now, if you've already had a big bang on your hands, the next best thing is to continue to support that great idea by baking in micro-innovation. If you haven't, the best way is to start small. Build in what you can, figure out what works at your organization, and grow it in a way that makes sense. It might even drive you to higher skill sets you haven't had in-house before. At DevFacto, we had a good range of skill sets through the years, but we needed a way to tie it all together. Without disrupting the success we had with specific methods or activities, how could we arrange all of these ideas in a way that would benefit teams that were building single-page apps, but also empower big teams on multi-year portal projects? These discoveries we made as we experimented with this led us to create our own framework to harness all of this. The DevFacto Innovation Framework. And this framework allows us to tie all these methods together in whatever way will get us closer to the outcome that we need. By surrounding ideation with other methods and understanding how those methods relate to each other increases our ability to do great work all the way through a project, but also give our customers a better idea of what they're in for and how they'll be involved. Having a framework also allows us to look for patterns that yield great results or improve how we deliver different types of work. With Diff, we can apply our best thinking to a broader range of project types. In the past, we might have said, there isn't a lot of room for innovation in data and analytics projects. And maybe because of rigid tools like Power BI, but with Diff, we can say opportunities in data analytics projects are different, and we have methods to tackle those too. Another superpower of frameworks is that because of their flexibility, they can be applied at all levels by anyone. For example, we use Diff to create a 5-year roadmap collaboratively with a team of people, and at the same time, a single engineer can use Diff to shape their day as they approach a single problem. So what does Diff actually look like? We have 5 modes in Diff: envision, define, make, review, and adapt. And you can think of a mode as a lens through which to plan and execute your work. Within a mode, we collect different methods or activities across our business. Now, there's a very general question at the intersection of each of these modes that loosely frames the intent and the outcome of each mode. And you can follow those questions through in a linear fashion, but as a framework, this is meant to support following the work, and if anything, breaking free of a predefined set of steps, meaning the result of a review might send you right back to envision or define, for example. You'll also notice adapt there at the end. How often in retrospect should we have pivoted during a project because of new knowledge or a better understanding? Why don't we give ourselves that chance more often? Some would say that, much like the Agile process, there's a risk of constantly pivoting and never delivering anything. But as we said up front, innovation doesn't happen unless we've made an impact. If we've all agreed on the goal up front, that goal should remain durable. Just the way we get to it in the end is what evolves during our work. Setting the right target and aligning on it is almost always the most important step. Now, a popular question for me in the last few months is, how do I use a mode? In starting any effort, you'll have an intent, often a problem that needs solving. With Diff, a mode allows you to focus on that problem at whatever stage it's at. Employ whatever method makes sense, make a mess, collaborate, research, question, before things start to come together towards that focused outcome. One of the important things is encoded in the shape of the diamonds. Each mode contains divergent thinking before convergent thinking. Now, I stress this as one of the key points of Diff. It's obvious to most people to start a project by considering a broad range of ideas, but humans typically then just march as quickly as possible towards delivering the first idea that they identified as good, and this is how many opportunities are lost. Again, if you're a team deep in implementation or soloing a 5-year plan, this simplistic review shows how work flows using the DevFacto Innovation Framework. You need a clear intent, a goal, or a target. You need to widely consider all the ways you might get there. Regardless of whether the task is largely unknown or you have a tried and true process to get you there, you should still slow down and ask a few key questions and take stock of what resources you have. With that outcome in mind, do you know all you need to know to get there? Perhaps the core team keeps moving forward while a few others validate a new hypothesis. Maybe the results of their work will create an inflection point for the rest of the team. Being flexible inside the scope of a project for this is critical. And ensuring that at any point in the project, a single member or the whole team can transition to a different mode, if that will help focus the work, especially in later stages. Now, just a note about intent and setting targets and thinking about ideal state. I hammer on this in our ideation sessions, but it's an important point for all of these activities. Innovation requires ambition, and that means setting targets you might find uncomfortable. Now, in a workshop setting with a bald guy who talks really loudly, I've seen a lot of people get there. But when you're planning your own work and you've picked up a task you've done 100 times before, how likely are you to push yourself? Certainly, you need to pick your battles and manage scope, but it's the goal you begin with that will shape the work you produce. Now, as I said earlier, inside each mode, we group all of the activities and methods that we're currently using at DevFacto. For example, these are a bunch of methods from one of our practice groups, and they've been grouped based on a typical project sequence, but they're also now assigned a Diff mode, which you can see with those little colored diamonds. Even late in a project, you can still find, envision, and define activities which are typically earlier in a workflow. But this cue is critical for our teams. Hey, you're shifting gears here. And this helps them to focus their current action properly, but also frame their next steps with more clarity. Were we just lacking the definition we needed to finish up a feature, or do we still need to make and test something to confirm a new hypothesis? As we said before, rather than single ideas, we want to repeat and operationalize this. And the same way we have with design thinking, agile systems thinking, that pattern is really important, wrapping great methods into a framework that connects the dots. Now, we don't have time today to dive into a bunch of specific examples, but if you think about a typical software project during implementation, this late in the game, we often assume ideal state thinking was already done. Maybe it's years of waterfall delivery, or maybe it's that lizard hindbrain we're wired with to survive. Now, it's not hard to amp up your prototyping effort on what could have been a really mundane task by exploring the ideal state of what you're working on and injecting some new ideas into your rapid prototyping. Maybe to validate those ideas, you plan some quick user shadowing that will allow you to compare what they do today versus how it could work tomorrow with these new ideas. At the end, of course, it makes sense to assess so that you can be sure you did move the needle with some usability testing. And as you can see, these activities might be well known to you, but something you might not be doing at this stage in the work. So that's a key point, and there's a couple here for you. Micro-innovation can happen any day, regardless of the type of project or the point at which you are in the process. It comes down to having an intent, acting on it, and measuring the outcome before committing to the next step. Things like usability testing are commonplace these days, but are you just using that to validate the work you did, or are you actually reworking and retesting the results? Are you willing to A/B test a well-understood solution against a crazy new idea? And if you're willing, how well does that new idea have to test to gain traction and get more attention? Now, a method like usability testing is a great help in assessing feasibility, but it's important to think about what else you might need. How might you assess technology innovations in your business? Now, over time, you can step back and notice the patterns of when great little things happen, which affords you the chance to try to build them into your own process. And this allows you not only to repeat the good things, but also improve at doing them. Another key point here is using a variety of methods and skill sets to improve how you deliver innovation. This has been critical over the years for us in putting teams together early with a good range of skills. It's pretty common in software situations to have a few people lead the charge and bring more engineers in later, as an example. And oftentimes, not only does that limit the capability and the vision of the team, but it also limits the methods that people might feel comfortable with and the collision of ideas that we unearth as we work. And as you zoom out from some of these things, as you look at and assess what your opportunities are and where you could inject some of these new ideas, don't be afraid to keep zooming out and to take a super broad view. This is about finding those different opportunities and being able to execute on them, be they people, process, or technology. Often it comes down to having the right skill sets on your team, but this can be helped by inserting different methods at different times as well, like I just said. Of course, different organizations are focused on different things, which will set them up for success in some areas of innovation, but maybe not others. And sometimes it simply comes down to your biases or what your company values. Big tech companies tend to value technical innovation, and often seasoned engineers will have a collection of patent awards near their desk. The problem is that they rarely find other types of opportunities, and when they do, the organization doesn't value them enough to follow through, assuming they even know how. I often still marvel at our work here at DevFacto because we have delivered great work in each area. Now, there's a warning here too that companies can develop blind spots if they're not intentionally developing all three. It's a balancing act. Biases, blind spots, and barriers. Now, talking about those three Bs, why not tell an innovation project story that started with a massive blind spot? I had the opportunity a few years ago to help a Canadian utility company refresh their customer portal. The question we started with was, how well can people manage their own utilities online? And as is common in software, this project started because of some technical end-of-life support issue. And we see far too many projects like this where the desired outcome is often a like-for-like description. And this is a fast and common way to kill innovation and miss every opportunity before you even start. In this case, we got the best start possible by putting their current portal in the hands of users and observing. And I was there, and it was a train wreck. And they didn't know why. My favorite was a 10-minute quest one user went on to find their own phone number in the system. They failed hard, and the executives beside me in the lab were tearing their hair out, willing that person to just click the tab. They knew exactly where it was. Now, to their credit, this pushed them to ask more questions and broaden their thinking. Why rebuild what we have when what we have doesn't work? And because they were open to new thinking, we assessed the whole customer journey and came up with a new structure that grouped features more intuitively and focused on common flows. One interesting aspect was the existing portal contained something like 177 screens, and our new approach, I think, was closer to 75. Now, we've said that innovation doesn't have to be expensive, and in this case, focusing our team's effort on less than half of the screens made us far more efficient right off the bat. Realizing savings like that can be a balance between saving some money or pushing that back into this release to release an even better project, or maybe save that effort for the next opportunity you discover. Early in the project, we used activities like card sorting and first-click testing to shape and validate our new information architecture and customer journey. Later in the project, we were doing weekly rounds of usability testing to refine complex features, all the way down to making sure that the icons we were using were intuitive. We followed the same pattern all the way through, though. Our focus of activities shifted based on the task at hand. And that pattern revolved around a rigorous testing schedule throughout the project, and we acted on the feedback. Sometimes there were little discoveries that we used to improve the portal. Sometimes they were big shifts that I had to go present to a room full of stakeholders. And I was clear with them that doing the best things we could do for their users was how we would deliver our best work to those stakeholders. They didn't always like how hard I pushed based on our weekly test results, but in the end, data won them over. We worked through people and process to deliver a much improved customer experience, and that alone was a big win. But we also envisioned a portal where their biggest, hardest commercial customers were happy to manage their own accounts. And I never saw the support numbers for a before and after comparison, but we know reduced customer frustration and customer support costs came down at the same time. Well, throughout this project, we found and acted on incremental and evolutionary changes that were not foreseen when we started. And largely those improvements were unexpected and came simply through the way that we worked and some of these habits and patterns that we've shared with you today. So let's just review quickly all of these things that we've talked about, because we believe that these key points will help you on your journey as much as they've helped us. Micro-innovation injected into your process, being willing to consider a really broad view of things, and being open to working on your 3Bs are things we've talked quite a bit about. One of the key points that's been laced all the way through, but maybe hasn't been said big enough, large enough, loud enough, is you need to be willing to embrace continual change. And as David said earlier, change is hard. So that was a short, but hopefully sweet look at innovation and how we approach it. And we thank you very much for attending today. We'll jump into the Q&A here right away. But if you need to leave, you can always get in touch with us online. Also, you'll receive an email from us within the next 24 hours directing you to the recording of this session and some additional resources that we've found helpful. Of course, we hope that you can use this information to accelerate innovation in your own business and practice, but we're always here to help too. The easiest way to engage us when it comes to innovation is to book an innovation Kickstart. It's a free session for up to 10 people that we facilitate and provide a findings report based on our assessment and recommendations. It's designed to help you discover and align on the best problems you should focus on solving in your organization next. Now, let's jump into the Q&A. I haven't kept a clear look at the chat. David, have you seen any questions come through?
Just checking right now. While that's happening, maybe we can just touch on something that we often hear when we do these sessions, either in a group setting like this or individually with organizations. And that's really how does what we're talking about here, and when it comes to innovation, how does this differ than kind of this iterative cycle that organizations are going through, where you envision an idea and you define it some more, and then spec it out and build it and test it and so on. And really, like, just to boil it down to the simplest statement, I've seen this question a few different ways, where it's, like, what does this actually mean? How does it actually come into play? And the key takeaway here, there's a few, but if I was to say one thing, it's about just really thinking about those activities that you get into a cycle on, thinking about how are they making the outcome better? Are you just working through a list of features that are getting completed on time and on budget and on schedule? Those are all important things, but don't let that feeling of success kind of blind you to the fact that there may be opportunities to make things even better. And perhaps there's I've fallen into this trap over my career, where you get into this routine and you feel good about it and there's progress, and you start forgetting about what you're trying to accomplish, and that's a meaningful, impactful change. So that I think that covers one of the questions.
Totally. Oh, I see a question here. I'll answer this first, and then I'll throw it back to you, David. One of them was, what was the thing that unlocked you the most as you started to get deeper into innovation? For me, I think it probably comes down to a great team. We talked about trust being important and a safe space. Even back when I was building things with my father as a kid, I found that I can make people who build things uncomfortable. The thing I'll hear is, we have to build what? Fair, totally fair. And as we've said, all through the session, these ideas are only valuable if you can actually get it out there into the world, right? If you can make an impact. But at DevFacto, I've been surrounded by just some amazing people from all skill sets, and the trust in any of the teams that I've worked on to deliver innovation has been incredible. And if we go together, we know that I won't get too far into crazy land, and they can see the value or the impetus of the idea, right as it's forming. And so we all have our hands on it, we all have our DNA on it, and nobody's off the wild, setting anybody else up for failure. So I think it's just being surrounded by a good team and the trust that comes along with that, knowing that we can take whatever is going to come. We can use all these ideas, we can shape them into something that will bring benefit that we can actually build.
That's good. And Taylor, I'll answer this, the first part of this question around building a culture of innovation. How do you build a culture of innovation?
Yeah.
And I'll answer it quickly here and see if you have something to add on to that. We didn't cover too much of that here when it comes to the actual steps you would go through. It's certainly much more complex than just saying, hey, get into this routine of iterative development and thinking about testing and failing early. Like there's all sorts of phrases you hear when it comes to that. I think from an outside perspective, looking into organizations over, and I don't know how many organizations that I've touched at my time at DevFacto over the last 15 years, but certainly 300, 400, 500 different organizations, and I see that some of them are really good at this, at having built a culture of innovation. And I've talked to some of those people involved in that change, and I've experienced some of that at DevFacto here as we've become more innovative. And there is certainly a focus on psychological safety. There wasn't a lot of talk of that a few years ago. It's certainly much more common now in the business world to talk about that. And really what it comes down to is one of the points we touched on, where ideas shouldn't be safe. You should be able to challenge an idea and talk about it and get really into it. You have to keep people safe, of course, and that's the balance that you always are struggling to maintain. And one of the things that, and we got to this quite early in our culture of innovation transformation, where when it came to running our ideation sessions, one of the things that we learned from the design thinking approach was to get some crazy ideas out first, like to really get into the crazy stuff. And as facilitators, we often do that, where we just put some ridiculous things up on the board. For example, if we're in a brainstorming session, or if we're in an activity that involves user testing and kind of refinement, and for example, like that usability testing lab that Taylor talked about, is to really just do crazy things that you wouldn't expect a normal person to do, but like show that it's okay to get out there. That's a key part of what we really established when we were engaged with these innovation activities. I don't know if there's anything else, Taylor, that you want to throw into that before we get to the next question.
Yeah, actually, sure. So, David talking about crazy ideas, actually, I can't even remember, there's something called the 3 I's. It's illegal, immoral, and I don't even remember the third one, but we used to just inject insane things. I still do, actually, into workshops, just to try to break people free and to make crazy be okay, to say, well, what would you consider, right? And that really is in service of one of the points I made earlier, which is saying, like, you need to start off ambitious, right? What's the biggest thing that we could land? What's the biggest impact we could make? Because oftentimes executing the ideas is easy. It's getting the right idea at the right time in the right context is where the magic happens. I mean, for me, as far as culture goes, I mean, you need you need a good plan, you need time, you need to give people time, but thinking specifically about the people, I think it comes down to, having a mix of skill sets and then supporting them with training and trust. And I think, to me, those are kind of the foundation pieces you need for a culture of innovation. I think that's probably all I'd say about that. Are there any other questions? I guess we're kind of running up on time.
Yeah, let's just wrap it up with one, and we can, if there's other questions that come in, we can connect with you directly as attendees. There, I'll just close with this one about our innovation Kickstart program and what that's all about. So we get value from just understanding what the problems that you're facing are out there, and that's why these sessions, they're short, they're a few hours, 2 to 3 hours, they're free of charge to you, and we come in and really just kind of walk you through. It could be an end-to-end innovation process, or it could be very focused on, hey, let's talk about some of the challenges you're facing, and let's go through an ideation session. Let's go through some refinement, maybe some voting, maybe, just to really give you a good idea of how you could move some of your initiatives forward, or some of the challenges that you're facing. How can you deal with them? Or it could just be to give your team a flavor for what an innovation session looks like. So happy to do that. You can book that online. You can connect to Taylor or myself directly and talk about that. And happy to engage at any point.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic, David. Again, just thank you all for attending. It was really lovely to spend a little bit of time talking about innovation, something both David and I are extremely excited and passionate about. So thanks again. It was wonderful. And we look forward to connecting with you in the future.